what happened over the next 4 hours broke every single person in that terminal. And I'm still not over it 2 years later. I swear to you, every single time I try to tell this story I end up right back there, standing in the exact same spot in Terminal C at Hartsfield-Jackson, clutching a cup of burnt Starbucks that went cold in my hand while the entire universe tilted on its axis and refused to tilt back. It was Tuesday, October 17th, 2023, 6:42 a.m. sharp. I remember the minute because I had just glanced at my phone to see if the Denver flight I was supposed to be on was still delayed, and the screen showed that bruised purple and gold sky bleeding through the massive windows, the kind of light that turns an ordinary airport into something that feels almost holy. The air smelled like jet fuel mixed with warm Cinnabon and the particular exhaustion that only comes from red-eye flights and too many time zones. I was leaning against one of those cold silver pillars, half dead on my feet, eyelids scraping like sandpaper, when the K9 unit flowed past me the way they always do, 16 dogs and 16 handlers moving like a single breathing shadow, black tactical vests catching the early light, boots and paws in perfect rhythm, leashes loose, tails level, doing the quiet pre-dawn sweep nobody ever really notices. Except that morning the world noticed. I saw it happen in slow motion with the lead dog first. His nameplate read Titan in bold white letters across his chest, a huge black and tan Belgian Malinois who carried himself like he owned the sky. He was maybe 10 feet ahead of his handler when every muscle in his body locked at once. Ears shot straight forward, hackles rose in a perfect ridge from neck to tail, nose lifted high, and he stared across the open concourse with an intensity that made the air itself feel heavier. One heartbeat he was scanning luggage like any other morning, the next his front paws actually skidded on the polished tile because he had already decided where he was going and nothing on earth was going to stop him. Then he did the thing no elite working dog is ever trained to do. He ripped the leash clean out of Sergeant Ramirez's gloved hand and launched. The metal clip hit the floor with a sound like a starter pistol, ping, echoing off glass walls and high ceilings, and before any handler could even finish the curse forming on their lips, the other 15 dogs blew formation and followed. 16 elite K9s became one living arrow, claws scrabbling, bodies low and fluid, a black and tan tide surging straight toward a single human being who had been standing alone beside gate C-18, quietly watching planes taxi the way old men sometimes watch horizons they once crossed and never thought they'd see again. He was maybe 5'7" in his polished dress shoes, 78 or 80 years old, wearing a navy peacoat that had been pressed so many times the creases looked permanent, a gray wool scarf tucked with military precision, and a brown felt fedora tilted at the exact angle that said he still believed in dignity even when the rest of the world had forgotten the word. In his left hand he carried a small paper Hudson News bag, probably a bottle of water and a pack of peppermint gum, and in his right he held a single boarding pass, edges already soft from being folded and unfolded the way people do when they're trying to convince themselves the trip is real. He hadn't been bothering anyone. He had simply been waiting, the kind of waiting that sits heavy on a man's shoulders because it's the last wait of a very long life. The dogs reached him in under 4 seconds and formed a perfect circle, shoulder to shoulder, a living fortress of muscle and fong and absolute focus. The growls that rolled out of 16 throats were so low you felt them in your breastbone before your ears registered the sound at all. Travelers froze mid-step like someone had hit pause on the entire airport. A woman's roller bag slipped from her fingers and crashed to the tile, but the noise barely registered because every ounce of oxygen had been sucked into those growls. Phones rose in a ripple, shaky hands trying to capture something none of us understood yet. Someone behind me whispered, voice cracking, "Oh my God, he's got a bomb," and a father in a Cowboys jersey actually yanked his little boy behind his legs as if bullets were already flying. I couldn't move. My feet had grown roots into the floor. All I could hear was my own pulse thundering in my ears and the deep, primal harmony of 16 elite protectors telling the world that whatever they had found was the only thing that mattered now. The handlers were sprinting, boots pounding, voices raw with commands none of the dogs even acknowledged. Titan, AUS.
Is, boy.
Luna, here, now. Chief, down, down.
Nothing.
Not a flicker. The circle tightened instead, bodies pressing closer, heads lowered, eyes locked on the old mun in the center. 2 of the younger Malinois started barking, sharp, frantic, urgent bursts that ricocheted off the ceiling like gunfire, and the sound made grown men flinch. And the mun in the middle? He never flinched.
Not once.
He simply looked down at the ring of dogs surrounding him, and the strangest expression softened his face. Recognition, acceptance, something ancient and exhausted and strangely peaceful all at once. He had been waiting for this moment longer than any of us had been alive, and now that it was here he wasn't surprised at all. His voice, When it came, was so quiet the entire terminal went quieter just to hear it, like the building itself leaned in. "It's all right, children," he said, deep and slow and warm like bourbon poured over river stones. "I know exactly what y'all are smellin'. Ain't no cause for alarm. Y'all just doin' what you were born to do." And then the world cracked wide open and let the light in. Titan, the same Titan who once took 3 rounds to the vest in a warehouse raid and kept dragging his bleeding handler to safety, took one deliberate step forward, pressed his big blocky head against the old man's thigh, and let out a whine so heartbroken it sounded like the dog had been carrying the weight of every war ever fought. It wasn't a warning. It was grief. Pure, raw, unmistakable. One by one the others followed. Tails dropped from high alert to gentle sway. Ears relaxed forward in surrender. Noses pushed softly into the wool of his coat, into the trembling veins on the back of his hands, into the cuffs of slacks that had once been part of a dress uniform. Luna, the golden shepherd with one ice-blue eye, actually sat and leaned her entire 80 pounds against his shin as if she could physically hold him upright a little longer. Chief, the ancient gray-muzzled warrior 2 months from retirement, walked forward on stiff legs, placed his chin on the man's knee, and closed his eyes like he had finally come home after 50 years of looking. 16 apex predators, animals trained to face down armed terrorists without hesitation, transformed in the space of a heartbeat into 16 grandchildren who had just realized their grandfather wasn't getting up from the recliner ever again. The growling stopped so completely you could suddenly hear the air conditioning humming overhead and the soft mechanical voice announcing a gate change 3 concourses away. The circle never broke, but everything about it changed. It wasn't containment anymore.
It was sanctuary.
They were shielding him from something none of us could see yet, something that had already been walking beside him for weeks. Sergeant Marcus Ramirez reached them first, leash dangling useless from his hand, mirrored sunglasses pushed up into his hair, and I swear I had never seen him and look so completely unmoored. 10 years on the job, face usually carved from stone, and right then he looked about 12 years old. "Sir," he managed, and the single word cracked clean in half. "Are you hit? Do you need immediate medical?" The old man gave the smallest, saddest, kindest smile I have ever seen on a human face. "No, son," he answered gently, voice steady even though his hand trembled on Titan's head. "I'm way past hurt. Been past it longer than you've been alive, I expect." He looked around the circle of dogs, eyes shining with tears he refused to let fall, and spoke so softly only the dogs and the handful of us close enough could hear. "I carried your granddaddies on my back through rice paddies outside Da Nang in 68 and 69, he told them, voice catching just once. "Lost good boys just like y'all to the same smell that's on me now. Reckon it never really leaves US, does it? Y'all still remember?
Good boys.
Such good boys." My stomach dropped through the floor and kept falling. Ramirez tried again, softer, almost pleading. "Sir, the dogs are alerting harder than I've ever seen. We have to clear the area." The man nodded once, slow and accepting. "They ain't wrong, officer. They just a little late is all." He reached into his inside coat pocket with the deliberate care of someone who knows every eye in a 50-foot radius is tracking the motion, and every handler's hand twitched toward their holster even though something in the air had already told us this wasn't danger. From the pocket he drew a single folded sheet of heavy cream paper, Emory University Hospital letterhead visible even from where I stood. He handed it to Ramirez the way a runner passes the baton at the end of the longest race of his life. Ramirez unfolded it. I watched the words hit him like bullets. Stage 4 pancreatic adenocarcinoma. Metastatic to liver, lungs, bones. Palliative care only. Estimated prognosis: days to 2 weeks. The letter was dated 3 weeks earlier. Ramirez looked up, and the eyes that met the old man's were already red.
"Sir."
"It's all right," the man said again, and this time his voice finally shook. "Name's Elijah. Elijah Ray Robinson. Sergeant First Class, U.S. Army, retired.
2 tours. Purple Heart. Bronze Star with V.
All the pretty ribbons they give you when they send what's left of you home." He attempted a shrug and the motion clearly cost him. "Doctors told me I had 2 weeks, maybe 3. That was 3 weeks ago. Woke up yesterday morning and the sun was coming through my bedroom window same as it did the day Ruthie and I got married in 69, and I decided I wasn't gonna draw my last breath under fluorescent lights listening to machines beep. Ruth, God rest her, she always said when my time came I better meet her where the waves sound like church bells and the sand remembers our footprints. Virginia Beach. That's where I left her ashes 12 years ago. Figured it was time I went and kept the promise I made her the day I shipped out. He looked down at Titan, who still had his head pressed against Elijah's leg like he could anchor him to the earth a little longer. Reckon the war's finally over, son. And that was the moment the entire airport collectively lost the ability to breathe. A sound escaped Ramirez that wasn't quite a sob and wasn't quite a laugh. It was something raw and human, the kind of noise a man makes when he realizes the world isn't as black and white as his training manual promised. He turned away for a split second, pressing his knuckles hard against his mouth as if to push the emotion back down. Then he keyed his radio with a hand that trembled so badly the static crackled like fireworks before his voice even came through. Control, this is Ramirez, K9 unit. We've got a situation unfolding at Gate C-18. Negative on any threat. I repeat, negative threat. The subject is a veteran. End of life stage. The dogs are refusing to disengage. They're protecting him. Requesting immediate supervisor, medical team, airline representatives, chaplain, and whatever else you can scramble. Hell, send everything. The radio went silent for 3 agonizing seconds, 3 seconds where the only sounds were the soft whines from the dogs and the distant hum of a plane taxiing outside, and then a stunned voice finally replied, "Copy that, Ramirez.
Everything is en route. Stand by."
But standing by felt impossible, because in that moment, with Elijah's quiet words hanging in the air like smoke after a battlefield, the entire terminal had transformed from a place of hurried transience into something sacred, and none of us knew if we were ready for what came next. By then, the gate area had fallen into a hush so profound it felt like the building itself was holding its breath, phones still raised but trembling in hands that no longer knew what to capture because this wasn't a spectacle anymore, it was a revelation. Nobody was boarding their flights. Nobody was checking their watches or complaining about delays. We were all just there, witnessing something that felt bigger than any one life, a moment where humanity stripped away its layers of rush and distraction and stood naked in the face of quiet courage. A woman in a sharp business suit, the kind who looked like she lived on conference calls and black coffee, started clapping, slow, deliberate, each strike of her palms echoing like a heartbeat in the silence. Then a gate agent behind the counter joined in, tears already streaking her mascara, and a pilot emerging from a nearby crew lounge added his hands to the rhythm. Before long, the whole terminal erupted into applause, hundreds of strangers giving a standing ovation to a man they had feared as a threat less than a minute earlier, their cheers building into a wave that washed over the dogs and Elijah like a benediction from the universe itself. Elijah waved it off with a humble shake of his head, his cheeks flushing beneath the silver stubble, but his eyes, those deep, weary eyes, betrayed the depth of it all, shining with unshed tears as he murmured, "Y'all don't gotta do that. Ain't nothing special about an old man tryin' to keep one last promise." Yet even as the applause swelled, the dogs never wavered, their bodies pressed closer, their whines turning into soft, reassuring rumbles, as if they alone understood that the real storm was still brewing inside him, and they weren't about to let him face it alone. But the dogs, they were the true anchors in that chaos, never stopping their vigil, never letting the emotional weight pull them from their self-appointed duty as heroes in fur. Chief, the grizzled old shepherd with joints that creaked almost as loudly as Elijah's, stood up on those stiff legs and positioned himself directly across Elijah's feet, laying his full body down like a warm, living barrier against the cold tile floor, his gray muzzle resting on the toe of Elijah's shoe as if to say, "Not yet, not without us." Luna, with her mismatched eyes that seemed to see straight into souls, climbed halfway into his lap despite her size, curling up like a puppy and pressing her head against his chest where his heart beat unsteady beneath the peacoat, her breath sinking with his in a rhythm that felt like borrowed time. Titan, the unbreakable leader, leaned his entire torso against Elijah's side, head draped over the man's shoulder, eyes half closed but ears ever alert, his presence a silent vow that no force, be it cancer or fate, would touch the soldier without going through him first. The other 14 dogs rearranged themselves in perfect harmony, some nosing at his hands for reassurance, others forming an outer ring that faced outward toward the crowd, hackles still slightly raised as if daring the world to interrupt this sacred guard. 16 heroes, trained for bombs and threats and chaos, had chosen instead to stand against the invisible enemy no human could fight, and in that choice, they reminded every single one of us what true loyalty looked like, unyielding, instinctive, profound. Elijah's trembling hand moved from one head to the next, stroking ears and whispering thanks, his voice breaking just a little more with each one, and as the applause faded into sniffles and hushed whispers, I felt my own tears hot on my cheeks, wondering how much longer this fragile bubble could hold before reality came crashing back in. That's when the dam truly broke, not just for me but for everyone within earshot, the emotional tide rising so high it drowned out the overhead announcements and the distant roar of engines. I wasn't the only one unraveling. Grown men in tailored suits were dabbing at their eyes with silk ties, their shoulders shaking with quiet sobs they tried to hide behind coughs. Flight attendants clustered in small groups, hugging each other tightly as mascara ran in black rivers down their faces. Even the security guards, usually stoic as statues, had red-rimmed eyes and clenched jaws. A Delta pilot in full uniform, cap tucked under his arm, stepped forward from the crowd and snapped to attention, rendering a slow, precise salute that he held without wavering, his arm trembling only from the effort of holding back his own grief. And then there was the little girl, maybe 5 years old, in a bright pink coat with pigtails bouncing as she broke free from her mother's hand and toddled straight up to Elijah, undeterred by the wall of dogs or the sea of adults. She stopped right in front of him, silent and solemn, and placed her stuffed giraffe, a worn, floppy thing with one ear slightly chewed, in his lap like it was the most valuable treasure in the world, her big eyes looking up at him with the kind of innocent trust that shatters adults. Elijah smiled down at her, his own eyes swimming now, and whispered, "Thank you, baby girl.
He's a mighty fine companion.
Reckon he'll watch over me on that plane ride." The girl nodded once, serious as a judge, then reached out a tiny hand and patted Titan's massive head, and Titan, fierce, unbreakable Titan, licked her fingers with the gentleness of a summer breeze, as if even he understood that this child's gift was part of the magic holding the moment together. I was openly sobbing by then, chest heaving, not caring who saw, because how could you not? How could anyone witness this convergence of vulnerability and strength and remain unchanged? But even as the tears flowed, the dogs held firm, their bodies a constant, unwavering shield, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something even bigger was about to unfold, something that would redefine heroism for every soul in that terminal. The airline moved with a speed that felt almost miraculous, as if the universe itself had conspired to bend time in Elijah's favor, but the dogs, they never let up, their heroic vigil a constant thread weaving through the frenzy. Within 8 minutes, 8 short, breathless minutes, a Delta vice president came barreling down the concourse in high heels and a half-buttoned blazer, her phone glued to her ear as she barked orders into it, gate agents already at her heels with laptops open and tears streaming while they frantically rebooked tickets and held flights. They canceled Elijah's original connection without a second thought, bumping him to the very next direct to Norfolk, upgrading him to first class with the window seat he quietly requested, and delaying the entire aircraft, 189 passengers strong, without a single murmur of protest from anyone on board or waiting. The captain himself emerged from the cockpit, hat tucked respectfully under his arm, and approached Elijah with the deference reserved for legends, shaking his hand firmly but gently, his voice thick with emotion as he said, "Sergeant, it's an honor." All the while, the dogs remained steadfast, their bodies pressed close, whines turning to soft huffs of breath against Elijah's coat, tails giving the occasional wag not out of playfulness but out of quiet affirmation that they were there, they were his, and they would not falter. Elijah tried to shift his weight once, testing if he could stand, but Chief leaned harder across his feet, Luna nuzzled deeper into his lap, and Titan let out a low, insistent rumble that wasn't aggression but insistence. "Not yet, not without us," and Ramirez, watching it all, looked like a man who had just seen the limits of his training shatter. He tried once, gently, to slip a leash back onto Titan's collar, but the dog turned his head and growled low, not at Elijah, never at Elijah, but at his own handler, a boundary crossed that spoke volumes about where loyalties lay in that moment. Ramirez stepped back, stunned, then looked at Elijah, at the dogs, at the growing crowd, and made the decision that would etch this day into legend forever. The unit escorts him to the gate. All 16. That's an order. But as the group began to form up, the dog's unyielding presence hinting at deeper instincts still at play, I couldn't help but wonder if this honor guard was just the beginning of something even more profound waiting on the horizon. And that's exactly what happened, the procession turning into something out of a dream, with the dogs as the eternal heroes leading the way, their bodies never breaking contact, their vigilance a beacon that drew the entire airport into its light. 16 K9 officers and their handlers fell into formation around Elijah like a living shield, Elijah at the center with one hand resting lightly on Titan's broad head for balance, the other clutching the little girl's stuffed giraffe like a lifeline from the innocence he was leaving behind. Passengers parted before them like the Red Sea, creating a path lined with tear-streaked faces and whispered prayers, and as they moved, Someone near Concourse B started singing Amazing Grace in a voice that trembled but held true, the melody catching like wildfire until by the time they reached the People Mover, thousands of voices had joined in, echoing under the vaulted ceilings in a chorus that felt like it could reach the heavens themselves. They even found a roll of actual red carpet, nobody to this day knows where it came from, maybe a storage closet or a miracle, and unrolled it from Gate C18 all the way to the jet bridge, a crimson path for a man who had walked through hell and back. Elijah moved slow along it, each step measured and painful, but the dogs never let him falter. Chief glued to his left like a faithful crutch, Luna on his right glancing up every few seconds to ensure his breath still came steady, Titan at his front clearing the way with quiet authority, and the rest forming a protective phalanx that faced outward, ears pricked, eyes scanning, as if even now they sensed the invisible threat closing in. Some dogs walked backward just to keep their gaze on his face, others nosed at his hands for reassurance, their tails wagging softly not in joy but in solidarity, a constant reminder that he wasn't alone in this final march. The emotional weight pressed down on everyone, sobs mingling with the song, and as they neared the gate, the captain waiting at the aircraft door with eyes shining, I realized this wasn't just an escort. It was a farewell, and the dogs, those unbreakable heroes, were the ones making sure it was done with the honor Elijah had earned a lifetime ago, leaving us all to wonder what final twist awaited at the end of that red carpet. When they finally reached the gate, the captain stood tall at the jet bridge door, his uniform crisp but his voice thick with the kind of respect that comes from one servant to another, saying, "Sergeant Robinson, on behalf of Delta Air Lines and every soul aboard this flight, it would be our highest honor to carry you home today." Elijah could only nod, words failing him as the weight of the moment settled like a blanket over his shoulders, but the dogs, they held the line, their bodies still pressed close, whines soft but insistent, as if they knew the separation was coming and were bracing for it with every fiber of their heroic being. Then Elijah did the thing that still haunts my dreams 2 years later, lowering himself slowly to one knee on that red carpet, every joint protesting, every breath a labor, and hugged each dog one by one, 16 embraces, 16 whispered conversations too private for the world to hear, his hands burying in fur, his forehead pressing against theirs in silent communion. When he reached Titan last, he cupped that massive head in both trembling hands and leaned in, forehead to forehead, whispering, "Thank you for seeing me clear, big man. Y'all the only ones who ever really did." Titan licked away the tear that finally escaped down Elijah's cheek, then draped his head over the old man's shoulder in a hug of his own, the two warriors sharing a moment that felt like it stretched across decades. The dogs never pulled away, their tails thumping softly against the carpet, their bodies leaning in even as Elijah rose, and as they loaded him onto the plane like fragile cargo, the entire cabin rising in applause, a Navy chief in dress blues saluting from the aisle, I couldn't shake the sense that the real goodbye was still hanging in the air, waiting for the engines to roar. They boarded him with the care of handling glass, the flight crew guiding him down the aisle as the passengers, first class and coach alike, stood in silent tribute, their applause a thunder that rolled through the fuselage like distant artillery. A Navy chief in full dress blues rose from his seat and rendered a slow salute that he held unwavering until Elijah was settled by the window, gazing out at the tarmac where the dogs still stood vigil. Back at the gate, the 16 heroes lined up at the massive window, noses pressed to the glass, eyes locked on the plane as it pushed back, their whines audible even over the whine of the engines, tails still wagging faintly as if sending one last message across the distance. They didn't move, not a single one, until the aircraft was a speck in the sky, their heroic watch unbroken to the very end. 2 days later, when the photo appeared on the Atlanta PD K-9 units page, Elijah in a beach chair at sunrise on Virginia Beach, feet in the sand, waves whispering like church bells, wrapped in a blanket but smiling with a peace that transcended pain, 16 paw-printed cards planted around him like sentinels, the caption said it all. He made it to the ocean. He kept his promise to her. We should all be so lucky to be carried home by heroes. He passed an hour later, as the sun painted the water gold, but the dogs had known all along, their heroism a bridge between worlds. And 2 years later, with 30,000 words spilled like tears, I'm still crying into my coffee, because some stories are carried forever, just like he was. Rest easy, Sergeant. The pack's got your 6. Always.